Brian Lehrer Live. We are here live every Wednesday night during the month of June at 7 o'clock. Now, as most of the news media relentlessly chase the same few catchy stories, we have the luxury here as public television to dwell on other things, many of them more important, and many of them really just as interesting if anyone would look. And in that spirit, we welcome our next guest, Shashi Tharoor, a writer of both fiction and nonfiction, and Undersecretary General of the United Nations for Communications. It's in his UN capacity that Tharoor has released a list of 10 underreported stories that they feel the world should know more about. Here is the list, real quick. 1. Somalia, more than a decade after U.S. troops withdrew. 2. A tragic blind spot in health care for women. 3. Northern Uganda, a need for more troops. 4. Sierra Leone, building on a hard-won peace. 5. Actors for Change, the growth of human rights institutions. 6. Cameroon, farming in the dark. 7. Grenada, the island after the hurricane. 8. Behind closed doors, violence against women. 9. A viable alternative, curbing illicit drugs through development. And finally, 10. Environment and health, new insights into the spread of infectious diseases. We will try to talk about 5 of these stories right now. So, Shashi Tharoor, welcome to CUNY TV.
Thank you, Brian. Good to be with you.
And I want to start with Somalia. Many of our viewers will remember the first President Bush deployed troops there to help with famine relief.
That's right. I mean, you remember there were babies dying on television when the troops went in. We had a lot of intense focus at the time. The famine's back was broken, but then violence erupted. You remember American soldiers being killed.
American soldiers being killed, the famous incident that got memorialized in the movie Black Hawk Down.
That's right.
Americans came home.
And so did the cameras.
And so did the cameras. And this country has pretty much forgotten about Somalia ever since.
Absolutely.
How's it going?
Well, what's interesting is precisely that it's going a lot better now than anyone dared hope for the last decade. We finally have the various warring factions agreeing on a government. That government is actually returning to Somalia, has in fact returned and is trying to establish itself there. They are really in need of international support and understanding at this very fragile moment when it could all go down the tubes again. And the media simply isn't there. I mean, I've never forgotten the photograph of the Marines landing on the beaches of Somalia with more cameras on the beach to film them coming than there were Marines.
Indeed.
I mean, I'm exaggerating a bit, but not a whole lot. Today, this government goes back into Somalia, and there are no cameras, no press. Of course, it's been difficult, it's been unstable, it's been a problem, but, you know, that's precisely why it's important that the world know what's happening back again in Somalia.
Now, your report here says Somalia is the only country in the world today to endure such a prolonged state of national collapse. What do you mean by such a prolonged state of national collapse?
No functioning national institutions, no functioning national government, no functioning national systems. Essentially, you've got a number of fiefdoms. There are warring, warlords who control certain parts of the country. You've got 2 parts of the country that have even declared their own independence. Everything is sort of run by private entrepreneurs as best they can, from running protection for people to be able to get from one point to the other, right through the generation of electricity, the functioning of private banks, you name it.
Sounds horrible.
It is, but that's precisely the result of the chaos that we all saw on our screens 10 years ago.
Because
we abandoned the country.
And it was in very large part, even then, a man-made, war-made famine, not a natural disaster.
Absolutely. I mean, the reason the Marines and those who followed them helped break the back of the famine is precisely because the famine was a result of the warlords controlling the distribution channels.
So what does Somalia need today that the outside world can still help it with? We're obviously not about to send back in troops under the guise of humanitarianism.
Well, I think if there were enough public support, that might have been a viable option, but clearly it's not, so I'm not going to waste your time or your viewers by talking about troops. I think what's interesting and what's valuable, however, is to give the government the support, both material support and the support of some sort of credible international presence. It could be observers. I mean, clearly the Somalis do not want troops from neighboring countries descending on them, but if we could have people who are there to show that this country has not been forgotten. Development assistance is important, humanitarian aid is important, international recognition, the whole works.
Let's take another of your 10 underreported stories, the growth of human rights institutions. By that, do you mean government human rights institutions in each country or independent groups that we know of like Amnesty International?
Both, but in fact this is particularly about the national human rights institutions, which are not necessarily governmental but usually have to be at least governmentally approved. Now why is that news? If you look at the entire discourse on human rights around the world, there's been a dramatic transformation. I spent 27 years at the UN, Brian, and when I joined, it was still entirely common for countries to say, well, human rights is a Western concept. This is, neo-imperialism by another name. It's the Americans thrusting their values down our throats. And others saying, look, in our culture, we don't need these human rights. We have either communitarian cultures or religiously based cultures or whatever. And that kind of talk was still widely prevalent. I think it's fair to say that in the 70s, I joined the UN in 78, we certainly would have seen a world in which human rights were not widely observed. In the last generation, as it were, the time that I've been at the UN, I've witnessed a dramatic change. Not just that more and more countries have learned to transform their societies into societies in which human rights are upheld, but that the ones who haven't, and we all know there are dictatorships and autocracies still in the world, that these societies are at least insisting on paying lip service to human rights. No one says any more human rights are bad. They say, oh, but we uphold human rights. How do we do that? You're not going to get human rights promoted in very many countries from the outside. You need to be able to encourage the growth of institutions which can, within the national context, the national framework, promote human rights. And that's happening.
And so it's a gradual, step-by-step process. At first, it may be lip service. It may be kind of a fake, do-nothing national human rights institution, but eventually, over time, they might develop some teeth?
Once they're there, they can never do nothing. They have to justify their existence. And it's fascinating. I can't name countries as a UN official, but I know of one particular case of a country that many would consider a tyranny, where the National Human Rights Commission is headed by the son of the ruler. But though this Human Rights Commission could obviously do nothing about political rights or political freedoms, they found themselves fighting the government on issues like unfair dismissal of workers, poor treatment of patients in hospitals, and so on. And the Human Rights Commission started taking the government to court and winning cases. Now, there's a great example of how the creation of a national human rights institution advances human rights in itself.
And just one of the examples, and there are many in your report, an official probe now taking place by the government of Mexico into the disappearances of more than 500 people during the 1970s. Well, maybe it took 30 years, but at least they're getting around to it, perhaps with international pressure. Let's go on.
Domestic too, but sure, go ahead.
Yes, yeah. And let's go on to another of your 10 underreported stories.
Brad, if I can pause for 1 second.
Please.
We very deliberately chose not to use the word underreported.
Yes.
Because if we did, we'd be pointing fingers at journalists. And we'd like to think that is not the journalist's fault. There are often reasons, including, of course, editors who think the stories won't sell. So we're just saying to the journalists, look, you're doing your job, but pay a little bit of attention to these things too.
Well, I'll tell you what. I'll use the word underreported. I'll point my fingers at the news institutions that are more interested in making a buck than reporting the most important things that are going on in the world. I said it, you didn't.
Oh, all right, Brad.
Grenada. Yeah. Just months before the tsunami in the Pacific, there was Hurricane Ivan in the Atlantic. How quickly we forget.
That's exactly the point. The cameras went there when it happened. In fact, I think everyone in America will remember that the Hurricane Ivan and the devastation it caused across the Caribbean, and particularly Grenada, which was the worst hit. But then the tsunami, we had this unprecedented outpouring of grief and solidarity. People rushed in with donations. I don't believe there have been more pledges made for any humanitarian disaster than we've seen in the tsunami. And look, I come from a country, and a part of India where the tsunami did hit, so I value that support. I'm not knocking it. But what's startling is how the crisis du jour, the headline of the moment, trumps the headline of the previous month. I mean, the people of Grenada are still struggling. Houses are still unbuilt. There are places that are still in utter shambles, roofs blown off, no repairs done. But attention's moved on. Funding has moved on. And this is one of the key issues, by the way, about why it's important to have media coverage. Because where the media goes, public attention goes, governmental responsibility follows, funding follows. And without the media, you're not going to get any support for any of these things.
Your report on Grenada says most of the country's housing lies in ruins.
Yeah.
Most?
Well, this is what I'm told. I've not been to Grenada myself, and indeed, we got exactly the same skeptical questioning from a journalist when the list was announced. So we actually checked with the UN Development Program Office in Grenada, and they said they stand by this. It is still most, and they said, come and take a look for yourself.
And still. And so what can be done in that case, and is anybody doing it?
Well, we're all trying to do it with the resources we have. We just don't have enough resources. So both the UN system and the government of Grenada and non-governmental organizations working there would appreciate it if people said, oh, We don't want you people to live another hurricane season without roofs over your heads. We're going to come in and help you or give you the resources so you can help yourself.
And how much harder has the tsunami made it to get the necessary relief for Grenada? Of course, the tsunami prompted the great reconciliation between President Clinton and President Bush the First.
Indeed.
Now we're going around the globe on tsunami relief fundraising. Does that hurt Grenada?
Well, that's perhaps too sort of reductionist an argument. By the way, President Clinton is now the special envoy of the UN Secretary General on the tsunami, and after his wonderful double act with President Bush the Elder, he's gone back on his own as a UN envoy, and we're counting on his continuing to bring attention to these things. But I do want to say, the tsunami in Southeast Asia and South Asia generally is now at the stage of trying to rebuild long-term life and recovery. Whereas in the case of Grenada, what you're seeing is we still haven't coped with the emergency. You know, whereas in these places we've been able to deal with the immediate consequences of the tsunami and we're trying to do long-term rebuilding, here in Grenada we still aren't there yet. So in a sense it's fair to say that when a major thing like the tsunami happens that's on the news channels 24/7, it does suck the oxygen out a little bit out of other humanitarian aid. It's not just Grenada, there are places in Africa we're not getting funding for either.
Let's go on to another of your 10 stories that the world should hear more about. Behind closed doors, violence against women. And you have some horrific stats here about the violence against women in many countries. Georgia, the Dominican Republic, progressive Sweden has a study that says 70% of women had experienced some form of violence or sexual harassment. So this remains a global issue.
Exactly. And one of the reasons, by the way, we put this in is not just because the issue itself is horrendous, it's important, it's underreported, to use your word, Ryan, but it's also because sometimes when we put these kinds of lists out, and we did this last year, this is the second year we're putting out such a list, people say, well, these are all stories about places far away. You know, our readers don't need to hear about this. Why should a reader in New York care about obstetric fistula in Africa, which is one of our top stories on this list?
What is that word?
Fistula. It's a horrendous disease caused by childbirth in 100 to 150,000 women every year, completely preventable with cheap treatments and medication, but which horrendously disfigures women. And, you know, we argue, since all of us have been born as a result of childbirth, we should care about diseases caused by childbirth. We don't. We feel that story should be there. But when we talk about stories like that, people say, well, why is it of interest to us here in New York and the developed world? So we said, let's put in a story that in fact does matter to the developed world, because violence against women is happening in the developed world as well. Rich countries and poor countries have comparable figures of violence against women. It's a shocking situation.
Do you believe that, though? Do you believe that rich countries, Western industrial countries, have the same rates of violence against women as poor developing countries, with all the feminism that's taken root? Because Western, you know, more industrial countries tend to be the democracies, tend to be the places where feminism as a social movement would have taken root. So do you really believe that?
Unfortunately, it's true, and the figures show it. You take a country like Sweden, which was feminist long time before the US was, and you're finding that 70% of the women today say they've suffered this. Look at places in Africa. There will be countries which don't have that kind of incidence. Now, of course, there are countries where there's civil wars raging, where rape is being used as a tactic of warfare by guerrilla groups and that sort of stuff. And yes, there, of course, the violence figures may be higher and worse. But the fact that this exists at all, I think, is a standing reproach to all of us in societies that consider ourselves civilized.
You know, one of the most feminist things that Sweden does is that in order for families to take advantage of the child care leave, the paid child care leave that the government requires corporations to give them, the father has to take some of that child care leave.
That's right. Paternity leave was invented in Sweden. They also had the highest number of elected women in parliament. 50% of the parliament were women. They've just been beaten on that by Rwanda, by the way, which is one of our top stories of last year, where the Rwandan, you know, after the genocide, Rwandan democracy has seen women being elected to parliament and to high office in that country in numbers that have not been matched anywhere in the world.
How about that? One more of your stories the world should know more about. A viable alternative, curbing illicit drugs through development. Now, we usually hear about curbing illicit drugs through, you know, spraying from, war on drugs, spraying from helicopters or things like that. What do you mean through development?
Well, I mean, spraying from helicopters kills the crops, but it often kills farmers and their families too, in the sense that those farmers are simply not able to make a decent living or survive. Many of them go back to growing when the helicopters with their spraying have gone away. What we're trying to say is, let's have a model of alternative development where we say to the farmers, how much is this middleman giving you for your poppies? Why can't you make that much more money, or at least a little bit more money, by growing potatoes instead? We'll help you, we'll give you the seeds, we'll give you the techniques, we'll try and connect you to the right people, make sure that there's a market for your potatoes, and instead you can stop growing poppies. Everyone wins. The middleman, in fact, and of course there are many, many layers of middlemen, are the ones who make money out of drugs. It's not the farmer who's growing the poppies in the first place, who's profiting from this horror that affects all our streets. So what we can do is go to the source, stop the problem, and at the same time not create problems for the poor, innocent peasant whose life would otherwise be ruined,
so give
him an alternative livelihood.
Give me an example of a country where this is actually working.
Plenty. We're actually trying it right now in Afghanistan, but we've done it elsewhere too. We've done it in parts of Colombia, we've done it, which is a big, big challenge, long way to go, in other parts of Latin America, Peru and Bolivia. And we are certainly very, very determined to make Afghanistan a success story, because that right now is one of the world's leading sources of illicit drugs.
Right. And can you do it? Because I've heard stories from Latin America, for example, from Colombia, where, you know, we're told, you're telling a farmer who's growing coca, knowing full well what the market is in the United States, and getting a decent price for their crops, tell them now, okay, grow broccoli or soybeans instead, and they're going to laugh you off the farm.
Well, that's not entirely accurate, Brian. It's probably true in some places, and this is obviously a question of scale. We've got to be able to demonstrate success in some places first before we can move on everywhere. But I do want to say that if you look at how much this farmer, who may know what the market value is in the streets of Chicago, how much that farmer gets, he knows he's not going to be the one who's harvesting it, refining it, shipping it, and selling it on the streets of Chicago. Yes. He's a long way down the totem pole. And what he's getting for it is, in fact, not much more than he'd get for growing the other crops he used to grow. Of course, there's a combination sometimes of economic attraction for him and sometimes of intimidation. There are guys with guns that are telling him that he better grow this or else. And you need a combination of everything. You need the alternative development strategies we're talking about, and you need effective law enforcement as well. And of course, sometimes both are not always available.
I want to ask you one thing before you go. Tomorrow, I understand your boss, Secretary General Kofi Annan, is going to release a report called The State of the World.
Pretty much.
That's pretty ambitious. Well, what is the state of the world?
It's a very slender report, but what it's trying to do is it's looking at the Millennium Development Goals, which were the goals agreed upon by the largest single gathering of heads of state and government in human history, the Millennium Summit in New York in 2000. They got together and they pledged to fulfill certain targets by 2015. Targets about halving poverty, rolling back HIV/AIDS, educating girls. They're very specific targets. And we have produced a detailed report that took 20 different UN agencies' inputs to produce that will actually show you what progress has been made 5 years on against each of these targets in each of the regions of the world.
And this, I take it, is related to the Millennium Challenge here at the U.S. level that President Bush has spoken about. But Tony Blair, the British Prime Minister, was just in Washington yesterday asking for more U.S. help for Africa, and he didn't get it. He didn't certainly get nearly what he was asking for. Does this put a crimp in the plans?
Well, he's got an announcement of $674 million of American humanitarian aid, and that's always welcome. We'd never sneer at something back. But he asked for a lot more, and Africa needs a lot more. And we feel that apart from humanitarian aid, it needs debt relief, it needs development assistance, it needs fair trade. Many African countries just want to trade themselves out of poverty. And that whole broad agenda is what Africa needs, not just some humanitarian aid. But I do want to say, if you look at these Millennium Development Goals, these are realizable targets, as long as the world has the political will to find the resources we need to fulfill them.
Shashi Tharoor, Under Secretary General of the United Nations, with 10 stories the world should know more about. Now you know at least about some of them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian. Good to be with you.
And up